So for those of you in the room who don't know me, my name is Pete Hollings. I'm Chair of the Geology Department at Lakehead, and I'm also Director of CESME, the Centre of Excellence for Sustainable Mining and Exploration. And it's our privilege today and our honour to co-sponsor this event. We're very excited to do so, and we're thrilled at the turnout. It's great to see so many people here. Hopefully this will spark some lively discussion, some good-natured discussion as we go through today's session. You can tell I'm kind of trying to spin things out until we get our third panelist up, who's hiding downstairs at the moment. Yeah. I told Glenn not to do lawyer jokes this morning, but he just can't help himself. That's quite all right, Jason. Before we get started, I know there are biographies in your package you were given when you came in. Let me just introduce our panel. To my immediate left is Dr. Jason Mcclain. Jason is an assistant professor in the law here at Lakehead. He specializes or works on legal and interdisciplinary approaches to climate change, sustainable development, and corporate social responsibility. Next to him is Glenn Nolan. Glenn is currently the Vice President, Aboriginal Affairs for Noront Resources. Has a long career in the minerals industry behind him, has been past president, or is currently past president of PDAC, one of the primary mining organisations, and was chief of the Mississauga Cree First Nation from 2001 to 2010. And then at the far end of the table is Janet Sumner. Janet is currently the Executive Director of CPAWS Wildlands League, and she has been in that role since 2003. She has been involved with legislative reforms for a number of years, having worked on the Mining Act, Far North Act, and Endangered Species Act. So we have here a very unique and qualified panel, I think, to talk about the question of what exactly is sustainable resource development and how can we do that. As director of CESME, one of the questions I frequently get asked is how can we have a centre for sustainable mining? Mining by its very nature is unsustainable. We're removing a finite resource from the ground. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's a question I've developed an answer to. I'm hoping to be able to improve that answer in the next few hours, talking to this group. But I think one of the things that we need to think about in the broader picture, and some of the things I'm hoping we're going to bring out today, is that when we talk about sustainable mining, we're talking about the sustainable impact on the communities around those mines. So finding ways to make that resource development leaving long-term beneficial impacts on those communities, not ghost towns which fold up when the mine does. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. We're slightly ahead of schedule, but that's not a bad thing. It leaves us more time for discussion. The way we're going to run the panel today is each of the panelists has been asked to prepare maybe 5 or 10 minutes of introduction to what they think the sustainability means. And then we're just going to move on and open the floor up to discussion and see where that conversation leads us. So we're going to start with Jason. So Jason, if you want to come up here and give your opening words, and then we'll go from there.
Great. Thanks, Pete. Good morning, everybody. Whoa, that is loud. I'm not sure I really need that, but I totally don't need that. All right, what Roy says goes. That's one of the rules in the faculty. So good morning. Thanks for showing up today and coming out and spending some time to listen about sustainable development. I want to begin by quoting a statistician, a famous statistician who's meant a lot to my own intellectual development, John Tukey. And he said once in an article in 1961, a riveting piece called The Future of Data Analysis. I have copies if anyone's interested. A far better and approximate answer to the right question, which is often vague, than an exact answer to the wrong question, which can always be made more precise. Now, I think those words are apt and have as much to teach us about sustainability as they do about data analysis, and I'm going to try and talk about why in my brief amount of time before Peter tells me to sit down and be quiet. I think, and I'm going to maybe propose a little bit controversially, that when it comes to sustainable development, and whether we're talking about the Ring of Fire, whether we're talking about Canada, whether we're talking about the global economy, we're not asking the right questions. So we need to heed Professor Tukey's brilliant advice and begin to ask the right questions. And what do I mean by that? Well, first, because maybe sustainable development and the concept isn't as obvious to everyone here as it is to the panelists and the people participating, I'll just offer a very brief definition. I'm going to talk about, as well, because it's a very apt time to be talking about this, the United Nations has launched its 17 Sustainable Development Goals designed to replace the Millennium Development Goals this fall. And sustainable development, according to the chief architect of the Sustainable Development Goals, an economics professor named Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia University, he defines sustainable development as economic prosperity that respects planetary boundaries and social inclusivity. But he adds, and that's a rather standard definition, that the international community has been developing over the last 30 years or so. But he adds a crucial fourth dimension to that, which is good governance. So you can't hope, both in terms of as a normative goal, as an aspiration, but also as an analytic process, we can't hope to integrate economic, environmental, and social considerations unless we have a mechanism to do so. And what Sachs points out as the mechanism capable of doing so is good governance. Now, what he means by good governance is two things. He says, and crucially, in a book that everybody should read, I think, called The Age of Sustainable Development, that good governance can't apply only to governments. It also has to apply, I can see some of my students smiling at that comment about the book because they maybe don't think it was as good as I do. But you'll just have to trust me and not believe them. He argues that good governance has to apply not only to governance, but also to governments, but also to transnational corporations. Too often, though, is the case, Sachs argues, that, and just as with government, the reality is often the reverse. Transnational corporations are often involved in bribery, corruption, money laundering, tax evasion, and a whole other parade of horribles. So the first right question that I think that we need to be asking, and this actually boils down to Sustainable Development Goal number 17 in particular, so 17 of 17, which is implementation. How do we go about implementing sustainable government? If good governance is the critical processual dimension of sustainable development, and if good governance is sorely lacking, not only in developing countries, I would argue, but in developed countries, just like Canada, then how do we overcome the obstacles to good governance? And what that means is framing the question in the right way. And the question is, how do we redirect legislation and regulation that's supposed to be in the public interest back toward the public interest and away from the special interests of industry that all too often are able to capture our governments and our regulations? A great example of what I'm talking about, and I can only sketch the surface, unfortunately, but I'm happy to talk about it at length with anybody who's interested. There have been a number of bills throughout the world, in Canada, Australia, the United States, and the UK, attempting to legislate better behavior on the part of transnational corporations involved in the extractive industries. All of those bills have failed. Not a single one of them has been passed into law. And if you want some really fascinating reading, you can read the parliamentary subcommittee debates and the congressional debates with the discussions of those bills. And typically those bills are killed by industry lobbying. Industry lobbyists will argue that mandatory regulations mandating transnational corporate social responsibility, as opposed to the voluntary multi-stakeholder regimes that we presently have, which are failing to deliver corporate social responsibility in the areas of environmental protection and human rights. They will argue, and they consistently and repeatedly argue, that mandatory regulation will absolutely destroy competitiveness and it will lead to a flight of capital outside of the jurisdiction. And it turns out that these arguments tend to be very successful, whatever their empirical merits may be. So in another fascinating book, which my students have yet to read, so they can't roll their eyes at the suggestion, is a book by Canadian law scholars Audrey MacLean and Penelope Simons called The Governance Gap. And so what they point out in this fascinating book is, first of all, they provide evidence that these voluntary initiatives that I'm talking about, call it corporate self-regulation, is ineffective and has to be complemented by, and here's a radical idea, strong government regulation. We need a return to strong government regulation in order to close this governance gap. But all too often in our field, in terms of Canadian environmental law, in terms of corporate social responsibility and sustainable development generally, when people address the problem of regulatory capture and the lack of good governance and systemic corruption, we tend to treat it as an analytic afterthought, something that's, you know, unfortunate perhaps, but seemingly insoluble. So we move on and we address questions that we can deal with. So the first really right question that we need to ask is, and pursuant to Professor Tukey's advice, all there are at the moment are vague answers to this question, but it's nevertheless the right question. How do we overcome this regulatory capture of industry over public interest government regulations? So I'll leave that as the first question. I'm going to speak briefly, very briefly, about the second question that we're not spending enough time, in my painstakingly humble opinion, in terms of sustainable development, and that is how you actually go about integrating economic prosperity, social inclusivity within planetary boundaries. It sounds very good. We should balance these things. We should integrate these things. But we tend not to spend much time thinking about the actual analytics of the integration process itself. And so rather than delivering a kind of an abstract legal formula of how I think that should happen, although I do think that one of the goals of legal work into sustainable development is figuring out what an on-the-ground framework for this would look like. Instead, I'm going to talk very briefly about a fascinating article that was recently published in one of the leading journals on this subject, Nature Climate Change, by a group of, an interdisciplinary group of Canadian scholars who argue, and I think this argument is fascinating and really apropos today's discussion, that compliance with various treaties with Aboriginal groups and First Nations in Canada could deliver sustainable development. So what they argue in particular, they take as their case in point Treaty 8. And they argue that the ongoing exploitation of Alberta's oil sands in northern Alberta constitutes a de facto violation of Treaty 8, which guarantees, among other things, those First Nation signatories a subsistence livelihood. And there are all kinds of ongoing disputes in and around that treaty, including the granting of permits for oil sands extraction without adequate and sometimes any consultation of First Nations groups, deleterious harm to air, water, and various species through toxins admitted by the oil sands industry, and a systematic exclusion of Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge in the governance of the area. An example the authors give is the Alberta plan called the Lower Athabasca Plan, which has to date failed to incorporate traditional ecological knowledge of First Nations, including the controversial seeming advice that when water flow is low, then the amount of water drawn into oil sands processing should be reduced. Something as seemingly obvious as that has also been ignored, which calls into question whether or not the stated goals of the Lower Athabasca Plan, which are, again, to promote sustainable development, to balance economic, environmental, and social inclusivity goals, whether or not those goals have been hijacked, so to speak, by the singular objective of economic development. So what these authors argue is that compliance with Treaty 8 would actually lead to a number of benefits. It would lower Canada's net greenhouse gas emissions. It would spur investments in renewable energy and help us move away from our dependence upon non-renewable energy, and therefore spur investments in a green economy. It would help reposition Canada as a leader in international climate change governance, and it would actually take concrete steps to furthering the goal of reconciliation with Canada's First Peoples. So that's a concrete example, and I think we need more concrete case studies of that nature to show how integration can actually work on the ground as opposed to just being a normative ideal. So I'll conclude with this. In the same riveting article published in 1961 called The Future of Data Analysis, which I highly recommend, Professor Tukey talked about what he thought were the constituent elements of a workable science. And he said that a workable science should have intellectual content that is understandable in form and that survives or passes the most crucial test of validity, which is the test of experience. On that test, Professor Tukey said that pure mathematics was a dismal failure. I would argue at the moment that the concept of sustainability also fails that test, but that if we remain committed to it and we remain committed to asking the difficult questions, then sustainability can approach something towards a workable science. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Before we go on, I'll just remind everyone, if you haven't done so already, please turn your cell phones off or turn them to silent or vibrate or whatever your cell phone does. Next up, I'll bring Janet up, gives her perspective on this, and then we'll conclude with Glenn and go into the discussion.
Thank you. Which direction do you want me to point this? This way or this way? Doesn't matter. Okay. I'm starting with a few slides, and I'll just maybe give a brief introduction to myself and to the work that Wildlands League does. So Wildlands League is a nonprofit environmental group. We work on large-scale wilderness conservation. We routinely meet with progressive industries who want to have conversations. We meet with governments, both the provincial government, the federal government, and Indigenous governments. And we are engaged in dialogues right across the landscape and willing to pretty much talk to anybody who wants to have a conversation about the environment and the various issues that we have with regards to industrial footprints and how to attain sustainability. From my perspective, I'll just maybe mention a note about sustainability before I get into my slide presentation. I thought I would bring some of our examples forward that I could show you that are more questions that we have than answers, because I don't think yet that we have successfully defined or figured out what true sustainability means. And even in terms of how it tends to get framed, it is framed as an integration, as you were just talking about, between economic, social, and the environment. And I actually think that's incorrect. I think it's incorrect because if it is not done within the bounds of what the planet can sustain, then you actually can't have an economic or a social society. We live on a planet that has to sustain us. If we are going beyond those bounds and trying to treat it as that three-legged stool where we're trading off, then we actually are going to break the back of the environmental system, and we won't be having a conversation about the economics or the social. So from the perspective of an environmental organization, we see it very much as you have two things that you're trying to balance within the perspectives of how do you maintain and keep the ecosystem going, because those ecosystems provide invaluable services to keep the society and the economic system going. So it's not a three-legged stool. So I'll just start with that as my opening comment. My lawyers have advised me to tell you I'm not a lawyer, so I'll also mention that. For good reason, because we're involved in legal challenges as we speak, so if anybody has any questions about those, I'm not a lawyer. This part of the world is home to 5 of the last great rivers. And these watersheds are the Albany River watershed, and by the way, I've traveled most of these, not the full length of the Albany, but a good portion of it. The Attawapiskat watershed, the Equan, the Winnisk. Actually just did a trip this summer where we went up the Winnisk watershed with Sam Hunter, and we ended up on the coast out at Cormorant Point, and he took us to a traditional hunting and fishing ground where we were able to see polar bears. And the very first night, I'll just tell you a small anecdote, when we arrived at the Cormorant Point, we'd spent 3.5 hours in a boat on Hudson Bay and sort of being lashed by the wind and the rain, and arrived to find a great big massive polar bear on our campsite. And so we got what we wished for, which was to see a polar bear. Sam and the other guides were very laid back about it, and managed to make sure that we had a safe place to land, and the polar bear went out to sea. And we got tons of pictures, and you might have seen some of those. They were covered in the Toronto Star. And if you haven't, you can go back and look at the past editions. But it was an amazing journey just to go to the top of Ontario and see polar bears. And by the end of our journey of spending 3 or 4 nights out on the coast, we were actually sort of lackadaisical along with the guides. We're sort of like, oh, they're not even coming into camp. So that's how comfortable we got coexisting with polar bears on the coast. And then, of course, the Severn River watershed. So these, and that's just to situate us, that the Ring of Fire actually can or possibly will touch on 3 of those major watersheds, the Albany, the Attawapiskat, and the Winnisk. But what I'm trying to get across here is that it is a landscape level conversation. It is not only going to have an impact over where the mine site is, the footprint. When we talk about sustainable development, we should remember that mining is an industrial activity with an industrial footprint. It's not something that normally coexists in nature. So what we're trying to do is minimize the footprint, mitigate, and manage it in such a way that these ecosystems that exist actually still survive and contribute to the overall health of the community, whether it's social or economic. This is the Mississauga Caribou range, and just to give you some further context for this, making sure that we ask the right kinds of questions. The Mississauga is sort of in the middle there, right where Martin Falls is, and that's been a designated caribou range. And in that caribou range, according to the government's own statistics that they're putting out, I think it was December 29th it got released, was a report on caribou range disturbance that said 1,100 holes have been drilled. And because of those 1,100 holes, about 600,000 hectares have been disturbed. The historical disturbance in this area, just from fire or whatever, in terms of the natural disturbance, would be approximately 5%, a little bit less than 5%. And currently it sits at 14.7. So we've tripled the disturbance, and we haven't built a mine yet. And very much thanks to Noront, they allowed us to come up and see their site, and this is one of the drill pads. This is to give you an example of the kind of thing. When I said that we have dialogue, we've been in constant conversation with Noront over the years, and also we're in conversations with KWG, and before that Cliffs. And Noront was very gracious and allowed us to come up and see their site, took us on a tour. We worked very well with Paul Semple, who was their previous president there, and COO, Chief Operating Officer, and we've always had a very robust dialogue with Noront, and they're very open and honest with us and share information so that we can build our expertise and our knowledge, and so we advocate from a position of knowing how things are happening. This is a particular drill pad, but we actually flew this site earlier this year, and this is the kind of linear disturbance that is occurring from exploration alone. And this is a wetland complex, and so these lines, these linear scars on the landscape, we've been told by scientists, because it's a very slowly, it's a slow growing season, it's very short, it takes a long time to mitigate this. It could be to the tune of hundreds, if not thousands of years to actually mitigate these kinds of lines. And what's interesting is we also went a bit further, and we went and had a conversation with some of the prospectors and said, have you taken a look at this? What do you think of this? And they were scratching their heads too, because they were sort of going, wow, this isn't what happens south of here. So even companies and industry experts who work in an environment, and I will say from my perspective, I've worked with many companies, and I find by and large that I can often have a very honest conversation with companies who are willing to do that, and practitioners in the area. And to be able to sit down and show these lines to prospectors who turn around to me and say, well, that's not how it works a little bit south of there. And they actually are now starting to work with us to say, how could we actually do something different? So I think it's in everybody's interest, but you can see this is the kind of impact that an industrial footprint from mining can have. So one of the things that we've been arguing inside of government and to government and publicly is there is a need for some kind of regional analysis and regional plan. While individual agreements might be struck with First Nations or Matawa as a whole or various things like that, it is still the responsibility of the provincial government to make sure that it is accountable and answerable to the people of Ontario as well. And in our estimation, that means you have to do some kind of a regional plan. You have to look at this suite of mines or potential suite of mines as if it might affect large watersheds. And the response that we've heard to date was, don't worry about it, we're going to do regional monitoring. And one of the challenges for us on that is we look at a case study from our experience of 8 years of looking at the Victor Diamond Mine, just to the east of the Ring of Fire, where what the government has actually required is for the company to report on 9 discharge sites. So they said, this is a very, a big undertaking. We met with the regulators who are responsible for looking at this. They told us that they designed the best ever monitoring program because they were well aware of the sensitivity of the environment, the industrial activity that was going to occur, the fact that this was a mercury-laden landscape, carbon-rich, and on a huge watershed. And they said, that's the reason we designed the best monitoring program ever. They handed the keys over to De Beers to execute that monitoring program and to report back on it. That report was supposed to be on 9 discharge stations. What we received back over an 8-year period was reports on only 4 of those, with all of them being either upstream or midstream and nothing downstream. In my estimation, that's an inadequate monitoring program. This is how it currently works in the province, where we design monitoring programs and then companies are responsible for monitoring their own behavior. They often give it to a consulting agency who then sits down and monitors that work and provides those reports. And sad to say that when we flagged this in our many submissions to government hadn't actually realized that they weren't reporting on this. So there's something broken in the system. Even when you design something, you have to be able to actually do the work of monitoring and following through on the requirements of that monitoring. So let's just put it this way, I'm not really a big fan of monitoring after the fact and hoping you get it right and hoping you can answer the question of just how much mining can a watershed hold. So for us, it's, as I said, large landscapes. This is the actual watershed. We did a mapping of the Attawapiskat, and you can see that the Ring of Fire is here, but what's actually really quite important is just to the east of that, so this is all activity happening on a single watershed. Just to the east of that are the Victor mine, which is already up and running. They're in the process, De Beers is now in the process of trying to move forward on the Tango mine, and they have 14 more, at least 14 more. So when I have conversations with the government, my conversation is such that I say, so how many mines can this watershed actually sustain? What point will you know? How will you know if you even already hit the limit? How do you know because you haven't even got the monitoring right in the first place for the De Beers projects? So how do you know if this watershed can even sustain another mine? As somebody from Kitchename, Kuzabin, KI told me, fish don't swim one way. So this watershed, it's very important that we make sure that we look at the entirety of the watershed, think about the environment as the environment operates, and start to plan for it as if we really do want to see a future for this ecosystem. So I've just sort of gone through these. So for us, the solution lies actually not in necessarily the regulations that you apply later, but rather in getting the right planning mechanism up front. That is transparent, is about dialogue, is about building what are the possible scenarios, what are the various things that you want to do on this watershed. It's not just mines, there's infrastructure, there's electrification for communities, there's roads, there's all of these projects that we want to actually see or potentially see happen on a watershed. So how is that all going to be integrated? How will it work? A regional strategic environmental assessment would allow you the breadth of discussion to put on the table, here are all the possible scenarios that we might consider for this landscape. This is how they might interact. And then these are the impacts of those. And then you could come up with plans that feed into the individual environmental assessments for companies. Companies are responsible for doing individual environmental assessments, and they need information as they go about developing their scenarios as well. And right now, the terms of reference for the potentially first mine in that area is inclusive of many of the things that we also think that the province should be doing, like developing baselines, work like that. So we are operating right now in the absence of a lot of the right planning framework. And that means you can also, one of the other things I'd like to underline is it's the ability to then give companies the right kind of direction. I was actually completely astounded when I talked to one of the companies very early on in my work around the Ring of Fire and said, well, you know, it's a mercury-laden landscape. It would be very good to be talking about what kind of mine design would prevent sort of the methylation of mercury and the movement up the food chain. And the mining expert that I was talking to sort of said, well, government's not even asking us to look at mercury. And in some ways, it's getting the right questions on the table from the start. And so for companies, I often find that they're being asked to provide information on this, and it's not even the right question. And so it really is important to have that planning framework up front so that you can have the interaction as companies sit down and you're not asking them to redo things or blame them after the fact. If we're going to be operating in a mercury-rich environment, it's important to know what the baseline is so that if it changes and it moves up the food chain, then companies are responsible for the delta, not responsible for what was the background level. So that's my remarks. Thanks.
All right, so to bring the panelist contributions to initial presentations to an end, we'll bring Glenn Nolan, who assured me he's wearing his best Perry Mason suit this morning. So we'll get that out of the way. Go ahead, Glenn.
Thanks, Pete. Good morning, everyone. As Peter mentioned, I'm from the Missinabie Cree First Nation and from the Bear Clan, and I have roots, though, in the city and west of here. that I continue to practice my traditional cultural activities out on the land with my family. And I think that's part of what I want to talk about is the sustainability of communities that have, I wouldn't say embraced resource development, but have participated in it in various capacities to demonstrate to themselves that this is something that will not only provide for their families, but also support development within their own communities. Whether you're talking about First Nations or not, the importance of taking control of their destiny through participation with these various opportunities that are out here. A brief note about Noront. We are the only company with a feasible project. We have about 65% of all the license claims that are in the Ring of Fire territory today. And recently we purchased the chromite assets from Cliffs, a multinational company that was mentioned earlier. Thank goodness we're not. We are governed under the laws here in Canada. We operate under the laws here in Canada, and we have to adhere to those laws, or else executives like myself will go to jail. And so it's very important that we as a company follow very strict ethics of how we operate here. I think one of the issues on sustainability is what is the long-term impact after exploration, mine goes forward, it's developed, it produces, and then it closes. What is the impact? We've heard about the environmental impacts, the potential environmental impacts, the disturbance to the lands, the disturbance to potential cultures to societies that participate in these kind of developments. I also look at it from what has it given back in a positive impact to those communities. And I'll use my community as an example. We've been in the mining industry, the modern mining industry, for 75 years, or maybe even longer. You know, my grandfather was a prospector. He worked in mines. He was a timberman. Uncles, great-uncles, worked in local mines in our territory near Mississauga. Became proficient at what they did, ended up getting a trade. Their children had opportunities within that mine or within other resource development projects in our territory to then apply those new skills that their parents had or the opportunities that were given to them to then feed on those to develop their own career choice, their path. And my community has embraced that. Right or wrong, we've taken that path. And we've taken that path for the reason that it's provided wealth, it's provided opportunities, and we have a variety of professions within our community, and not all resource-based. Some of them are still part of the mining sector, like I am. Even my son is an industrial electrician. My daughter is a banker. But I think what it provides us is an opportunity to see other opportunities than what we're familiar with in our communities. You know, we talk a lot about how we're going to sustain the environment, and I think we operate here in Ontario under a very strong regime. Can it be better? Possibly. But I think that comes through dialogue with organizations like CPAWS, organizations that are looking after the interests of the Indigenous people, whether it's Métis Nation of Ontario, whether it's the Chiefs of Ontario, to help formulate a plan that ensures the protection, the cultural protection, the social protection, the environmental protection, and the economic opportunities that come from this kind of development stay as close as possible to the region. And I know with Noront, one of the first things that we did, we've been in operation for a number of years. We had our first discovery in 2007, but we've changed as well. Our board was changed wholesale in 2008, and we've seen a considerable change to that board makeup since then. And I believe there's only one person, two people left on our board that were appointed in 2008. We have had a pretty consistent executive within our organization, and the plan is to create sensitivity within our organization. And I think more and more companies are doing that today. So they understand the communities they're working with, they understand the cultural differences and the values that those communities hold, and how it's different from Bay Street, how it's different from the industry, and the importance of understanding that so that our plans going forward match those cultural values, match those sensitivities. The only way we're going to do that, though, is through dialogue, and the importance of having ongoing discussions with communities, with the leadership, with the women's groups, with the church groups, with the youth, is to understand who they are and how they can influence the direction that the project is going to take. And I'll give you a couple examples. One was the community told us up front they were concerned with the footprint that we were going to have on the land with the mine development. So a typical mine would encompass maybe a couple hundred hectares in size of surface disturbance, even an underground operation. So we committed to doing as much as we could underground. We took that plan, gave it to our engineers, and said, what can you do with this? So we determined that much of our operations can actually be done underground. It's going to cost us more money, but it creates a couple of goodwill gestures to the community. The other one was a plan to have a slurry pipeline of our concentrate from our mine site to a terminal that was south of Webequie. The community was very concerned with a pipeline. We all hear about pipelines. This wasn't carrying crude oil, but it was carrying something that people were not sure what it was. So they said, we don't really like that idea. And we asked them, what is the alternative? And they said, a road. A road, we understand it. We think a road, we can participate in that much more, have greater participation on an economic side, maintenance side. Let's look at a road. So then we put the road as an indication of listening to the community. When we leave this project, 20 years' time, and that mine is closed, our goal is to have as many of the community members skilled in trades or in the professional end of things, so that they can take these new skills and go elsewhere, if there's opportunities elsewhere. But our understanding is that this one mine is going to lead to another mine. And it's with the dialogue that we need to have, not only with government and the communities, but with organizations, environmental groups, that will help us ensure that the long-term sustainability of the land, not the operations, but the land is going to be there for future generations, so that those 7 generations in the future can benefit to the same extent of access to the land, access to the animals and the fish, and traveling the land as their ancestors had in much the same way. So thank you very much.
So I think we've heard 3 very different perspectives on the Ring of Fire and on mining development. But I heard a number of common themes in there, I think, and that was the issue of governance, how that governance works, who's responsible for that government, the need for it to be community-driven. And I think the sort of common theme I heard there was the need to get the right questions asked, and those questions could take many forms. But what I think now is a really good time. Let's hear the discussion from the room. Do you have questions for our panelists? What do you think about what was said in that last little period? Don't be shy. I know people in the room and we'll make them ask questions.